Obviously, horror has always had a home on the big screen. However, in a time before streaming, before instant access, before you could summon a movie, a whole catalog at the tap of the screen, at the tip of your fingers, horror lived on the television. And it was an event. Appointment television was more than just programming, it was a communal ritual. You tuned in at a specific hour on a specific day, sometimes alone, sometimes with siblings, sometimes with friends, and you let the flickering screen transport you to places both terrifying and wonderful, introducing you to nightmare fuel beyond your wildest imaginations that would stick with you for the rest of your life. For me, and for an entire generation, TV horror wasn't just background noise. It wasn't just content to binge. It was formative. It shaped our love of Halloween, our fascination with monsters, and our appetite for scary stories. From the Crypt Keeper's cackling introductions to the eerie Canadian woods of Are You Afraid of the Dark, from the surreal suburbia of Eerie, Indiana, to the interdimensional mysteries of The X-Files, horror wasn't simply content. It was a culture. It was the gateway drug to haunted houses and a lifelong romance with the genre of fear. This is my story of how TV horror shaped me and why it mattered so much for an entire generation, told alongside the historical currents that made those shows possible in the first place. See, horror thrives on suggestion, atmosphere, and the lingering dread that arrives after the lights go out. Television, more than any other medium, perfected the slow drip, one episode at a time, one chilling image after another, one weekly ritual that slips into your bones and sticks in your brain. If film is the nightmare you choose at the theater, TV is the ghost that moves in and eats at your dinner table. Its strengths, intimacy, availability, make it ideal for horror's most potent tools: the unseen, the whispered, the half glimpsed. Historically, TV horror has had to negotiate constraints. Budgets limited creature effects, censors pressed down on violence and sex, sponsors frowned on blasphemy or gore. But limitations often sharpened the craft. Editors leaned on sound and shadow. Writers learned how to smuggle taboo topics into allegory. Directors built dread with blocking, negative space, and the cut that you don't make. What resulted is a genre that evolved in waves: anthology booms, paranormal procedurals, prestige slow burns, each era refracting anxieties of the day. Cold War paranoia, suburban conformity, satanic panics, post 9/11 conspiracies, pandemics, surveillance, climate dread, and everything else that keeps our collective pulse up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then there's October. Halloween is horror's high holy day, an annual pact between television and its audience. In the weeks leading up, networks once stacked schedules with marathons, theme specials, and anthology reruns. Homes became tiny cineplexes of fear, Treehouse of Horror Nights, Roseanne Prank Wars, AMC's Monster or FearFest, Disney Channel double features featuring witches and closet goblins. Television made Halloween bigger, more public, more communal, more ritualized, while Halloween in turn sanctified television's power to spook and delight. Most importantly, television made horror social. Long before fan forums, you circled titles in the TV guide. You traded videotapes. You debriefed at lunch, and then there's Halloween itself. Networks dressed themselves in cobwebs, spooky indents, marathons, and themed promos. Nobody liked commercials. Commercials were the time that you ran off to go do whatever you needed to get done until it hit October, because everything was themed. October didn't just feature horror. October felt like television itself became part of the haunted attraction. The medium and the holiday sealed a pact. We'll give you the scares. You tune in for the ritual. We kick off our hike through the history of horror on TV in a time before makeup kits and monster suits. The earliest televised spooks were basically voices wearing faces. On the television Ghost, running from 1931 to 1933, you saw staged murdered souls giving monologues straight into the camera. It had a minimal set with nothing more than a story about how they died. Was it primitive? Absolutely. But even through crude lenses, the format revealed something permanent. A camera and a confession can summon the uncanny. See, horror's first great teacher was the radio. Programs like Lights Out and Inner Sanctum had already mastered the 5 to 15-minute shiver, the hook, the escalation, the twist, and the goodnight, pleasant dreams flourish. TV borrowed those bones from those broadcasts and created something new out of it. With an anthology structure, host introductions, and the twist that lands like a trapdoor punctuating that final line. By the time the 1950s rolled around, the television set had become the domestic hearth, a mutual gathering point for the American family. When television matured post-World War II, respectable darkness arrived with two simple words: good evening. Alfred Hitchcock Presents debuted in 1955, running for a decade, and it set a standard for dark storytelling. See, it wasn't exclusively horror, but Hitchcock's presence legitimized the craft of the macabre on TV. Hitchcock's silhouette sauntered across the screen to a jaunty funeral march. The episodes were mostly crime and suspense focused, but the show's grammar, arc narration, moral irony, and discipline legitimized televised macabre. NBC famously refused to air the episode The Sorcerer's Apprentice for being too grisly. It was an early example of TV's constant dance with decency, a dance that would go on for decades to come. But the refusal only proved the point that horror had moved to primetime. That line would be negotiated episode by episode, and there was no going back. Censorship still shaped the form, though. You couldn't show mangled bodies, but you could cut to a swinging lampshade. You couldn't say hell, but you could imply damnation with a smile. TV learned how to scare with ellipses, and there was none better at the time than Alfred Hitchcock. Fast forward to 1959, and horror on the TV would get a new leading man in the form of Rod Serling, with the introduction of The Twilight Zone, premiering in 1959, running through to 64. This is often shelved with sci-fi, and there are a lot of sci-fi elements to it, but many of its greatest tales are horror and allegorical clothing. So many of my roots in TV horror start exactly here. See, I didn't always get the deep messaging in these stories, but I knew the strangeness and macabre really got to me. Stories like The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street take a leafy cul-de-sac and turns porch lights into interrogations. The monster itself is paranoia, and its costume is your neighbor's bathrobe. Eye of the Beholder builds dread through cuts, bandages. The reveal isn't just a shock. It is an argument about conformity. When Annabelle is all the rage and dominating the conversation for the best haunted doll, a whole generation still remembers Talkie Tina. See, Living Doll proved that tone and voice can be deadlier than any blade. Serling's genius is that every twist points back at us, the viewer. In a medium that was policed by sponsors, moral horror let the knives land legally. Then you have The Outer Limits from 1963 to 1965, which leaned heavily into science horror hybrids. The Xanthi Misfits gives us insectoid criminals exiled to Earth, a grotesque vision of otherness that doubles as a lesson in xenophobia. The Sixth Finger turns evolutionary ambition into horror with intellect. Where Twilight Zone scolds, Outer Limits warns. Inner Darkness and Outer Cosmos rhyme. Serling would return in 1970 with the Night Gallery, running for 3 years, where he would hang short nightmares as paintings and step in to introduce them with a weary gravitas. The palette is darker. The stories are more supernatural. Poe and Lovecraft adopted for a network that was still twitching about showing the real face of evil. You could feel the tug of war between a creator pushing into abyssal tones and a broadcaster rearranging the furniture to try to keep the room as presentable as possible. Honestly, my real ritual didn't start with new episodes. It started with reruns. Local stations, late night cable that would stack shows like Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, Alfred Hitchcock Presents late at night. When I first found them, it was like stumbling on a late night club, a secret menu that I should have never known about. But quickly, what started off as happenstance became ritual. I knew exactly where to find it, where to tune in, and what time. Yes, it was usually somewhere in the middle of the night, because when a kid can't sleep, this is exactly what they should be watching. This was different than what I had experienced before. This wasn't my very first introduction into horror, but this also was not a masked killer or a dream demon. This was deep horror that made me think. In 1966, the game would change again when a daytime soap opera invited a vampire in for a long stay. Dark Shadows premiered in 66, ran to 71, and it serialized the Gothic. It showcased seances, curses, time travel, and the tormented Barnabas Collins, who received fan mail like a matinee idol. The show's live-to-tape wobble, visible microphones, flubbed lines didn't hurt it at all. It gave it a haunted presence. The charm is in the imperfection. There's a sense that anything and everything could go wrong. Horror and soaps met and realized they share a fetish: cliffhangers. By the time the 70s rolled around, the TV horror movie came to life as an art of implication. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark premiered in 73, and it pits a woman against whispering goblins in her house's walls. That final image, ankles dragged towards a fireplace, stays lodged in the mind decades later. Trilogy of Terror, 75, ends with Amelia, in which Karen Black battles a Zuni fetish doll with needle teeth. It's chaotic, tiny, and indemnable. Proof that scale means absolutely nothing if your idea is sharp enough. And then, a legend was born, a timeless classic talked about still to this day. 1979's Salem's Lot, a two-night miniseries that brought Stephen King's vampires into the home through our televisions with cinematic confidence. A boy scratches at the window in the fog. Light taps, a slow drift, fingernails on glass. See, you don't need arterial spray to create a legend when the air itself feels unhealthy. While these movies and miniseries were dominating the airwaves, you also had other shows like Kolchak, the Night Stalker, running from 74 to 75. It gave us Carl Kolchak, a reporter in a straw hat who keeps tripping over monsters while Chicago insists they're accidents. The Ripper and the Spanish Moss murders crystallized the formula. Skeptical editor, reluctant cops, folkloric threat, all linked to urban stress. It is the proto-paranormal procedural, the Monster of the Week format married with casework. Chris Carter would go on to admit that when he built the X-Files out of these bones, this was a direct inspiration for him. This is the era where Halloween and horror started to date. They set the prototype of what would become a seasonal holiday tradition. Daily soaps, two-night events, weekly hunts. This is the era where TV started to yoke horror to calendars and to clocks. From this point, we move forward a little bit into one of the most debated eras of television horror. See, when you ask someone what is the most important, the most impactful decade for TV horror, you may get some people who say the 70s, but generally that conversation is going to hinge on two answers, either the 80s or the 90s. Debates rage on which decade truly is the king. But regardless of which one you land on, one simple truth exists. Cable loosened the collar that had been holding TV horror back up to this point. The late 80s and 90s are when TV horror kicked the doors in and made itself at home. It normalized a whole new level of horror in the home. In one lane, you had cable anthologies that strutted around with movie-level swagger, bloodier, bolder, and happier to punish their characters than primetime had ever allowed before. In the other lane, you had kids' TV, which claimed the campfire as its own, inviting younger viewers into the circle and teaching them how to tell a scary story, slowly but surely helping them learn the ropes. Between these two lanes ran a third road, the paranormal procedural. Folks that aren't necessarily here for the blood, but definitely here for the weird, which made the flashlight cone and the basement crawl space into weekly meeting rituals. Altogether, they formed this feeling that so many of us still associate with October today. If you grew up in a certain era, this is why there is a sense of nostalgia to how things used to be around Halloween. The sense that the entire dial had slipped a few degrees toward the uncanny, and you could pick your preferred flavor of fear any night of the week. We start with the crown jewel, Tales from the Crypt. HBO's freedom meant violence that stung, language that drew blood, and a delight in poetic justice that felt ripped straight from the yellowed EC comics that inspired it. The Crypt Keeper. He wasn't just a mascot. He was a mission statement. His rotted tuxedo, glass shard voice, and cascade of terrible puns told you, we are going to the bad place, and we're going laughing. The series was a parade of talent. You had Donner, Hills, Zemeckis, Hooper, Mary Lament behind the camera, Demi Moore, Tim Roth, Patricia Arquette, just to name a few. But what made it essential wasn't the glam. It was the discipline. Each episode worked like a sharp little fable. Vice exposed, desire indulged, fate delivered with a twist. And all through the house remains a perfect micro slasher for the Christmas season. Christmas Lights turned into crime scene tape. The Man Who Was Death turns an executioner's certainty into his trap. Yellow plays like prestige war drama until the last turn of the knife. It's EC morality, but framed with expensive toys and the audacity of a network that didn't have to apologize. See, Tales from the Crypt was the decadent end of horror anthology. Half an hour, one bad deed, and a comeuppance that landed like a judge's gavel. Every episode moved with a wicked rhythm. Cold open shock, a lord set up dripping with sex and greed, then a final twist that punished the worst impulse in the room. The Crypt Keeper's cackle was a whole other level. It wasn't just window dressing. It framed the whole thing like a twisted carnival. It shot through your spine as a child and latched onto your brain. I remember when I was a kid, I could hear that and be in a sleep. It would wake me up. Because it lived on HBO, the show could stage gore like a punchline and make its morality sting. The visual language announced itself. Comic book angles, candy-colored lighting, a camera that strutted like it knew the ending. You didn't watch Tales from the Crypt to solve what was going to happen. You watched to see how the episode would spring the trap. It taught TV horror that anthology could be stylish and very mean. That weekly horror could feel like a stack of dog-eared EC comic issues come to life. Now, away from HBO's polish, you had a grindhouse alternative. Tales from the Dark Side and its kindred spirit monsters showed how cheaply horror can be staged when the idea is strong enough. Tales from the Dark Side often felt like black box theater, 1 or 2 rooms, 3 actors, a sound design that did half the heavy lifting, and a sting that made you question what you just laughed at. You had episodes like The Cuddy Black Sow, a pure cursecraft, a folk dread that settles into your bones. Seasons of Belief invents a children's boogeyman, the Grither, and weaponizes the coziness of holiday storytelling. Meanwhile, Monsters, which was Darkside's rubber-suited cousin, was louder, pulpier, and cheerfully B-movie. It leaned into the title. Creature in the room, problem to be solved, twist of the cap. There's a sincerity to the show's homemade prosthetics and puppet work. It makes it weirdly charming. The fun was seeing what the constraint would produce this week. A claw under the bed, a hungry thing in the wall, a bargain you shouldn't have made, staring back with glassy eyes. Because it never pretended to be anything but a monster parlor trick, it could surprise you by slipping in a real bite when you were least expecting it. Even theatrical juggernauts retooled themselves to fit the weekly grind. Freddy's Nightmares proved TV could borrow a movie's aura without needing the movie's set pieces. Freddy mostly hosted, popping in to jeer or nudge while the stories played like comics, with dream logic hangovers. The Elm Street DNA, guilt, transgression, subconscious punishment, was all there, but tuned for broadcast TV's pace. The pleasure was in the voice. Even when the glove didn't swing, the episode felt soaked in Kruger's sarcasm and nastiness. Friday the 13th, the series, solved the weekly story problem with a clean engine. A shop full of cursed antiques sold off by accident. Every episode was a fetch quest with teeth. Track down the object, learn its history, endure the havoc. Then you outwit it, bring it back to the vault. That format made the world feel bigger every week. Every trinket you met implied 100 more nightmares out there. It taught TV horror a crucial lesson about IP. You don't need Jason. You need a container for stories that feels inexhaustible. By the late 90s, the adult lane sprouted hybrids. You had Poltergeist, The Legacy, which imagined a centuries-old order quietly fighting occult threats, proto-conjuring in its team dynamics and case file structure. It imagined a secret order balancing spreadsheets and exorcisms. Think libraries of Latin cathedrals with shadowy light. Team briefings about old sins resurfacing in modern cities. The show's pleasure was procedural. Archives, fieldwork, a plan, then a showdown that left the living a little less naive. Before ghost hunting shows turned case files into reality TV, this series did the occult case file feel like grown-up television. And then you had Millennium, which was the decade's bleak conscience. Frank Black looked at monsters without flinching, and the show asked whether naming the darkness saves you or scars you. The mood did the work. Damp light, winter skies, alleys where something human has gone wrong. Some weeks, the horror wore a religious mask. Others, the mask was bureaucracy or family dynamics. See, it wasn't about the jump scare. It was about the bruise that it left. If X-Files said maybe, Millennium said look closer. While the grown-ups bled, the kids lit a match. Are You Afraid of the Dark elevated campfire storytelling into a weekly ritual. The Midnight Society was the secret sauce. The stories are framed as gifts passed from kid to kid, and the show treats its viewers like co-conspirators in the ritual. It's not baby's first horror. It's you're ready. The tale of the dead man's float is still whispered about for a reason. The reveal in the school pool is staged like a slasher movie. It's proof that a great scare does not age. The tale of the lonely ghost turns mirrors into grief traps, and it rings a gut knot out of a single backward message. The tale of the ghastly grinner is color and tone, a jokey electric blue that worms inside of your head. But beyond specific episodes, what lingers is the routine of it all. The match struck, the circle leaning in, the sense that you too could tell one of these stories and hold your friends in the palm of your hand. Before streaming turned every night into a choose your own marathon, Saturday nights had a shape for young kids. And for a big slice of the 90s, that shape was an enormous orange couch. Snick turned 8 to 10 p.m. into appointment television for kids who had aged out of Nick Jr. but weren't necessarily at the point of grown-up television. It wasn't just a block. It was like a clubhouse with a dress code of pajamas and a bowl of snacks. A place where you could stay up late with permission and feel like the network knew exactly who you were. At its core, Snick solved a very simple problem that no one else at this point really had addressed: tween primetime. The mood was sly and a little cooler than daytime Nickelodeon, safer than network sitcoms, and just spooky enough as the night wore on. The graphics leaned into Halloween adjacent themes: inky purples, chalky blacks, slimy oranges, and the bumpers had an after hours hum and glow to them that made even commercials feel like they were part of the experience. The orange couch, sometimes plopped in surreal spaces, sometimes treated like a prop that fell out of space. It was a visual handshake. This is the place. These are your people. Come on in. Lineup shifted over the years, but the rhythm became instinctive. A breezy fourth wall breaker like Clarissa explains it all, or a sketch variety jolt like Roadhouse or All That, pulled you in with jokes and attitude. Anchors like The Secret World of Alex Mack or Kenan and Kel kept the pulse up. Kids with agency, a little mischief, a little heart, and then one way or another, the night bent towards the strange. Sometimes it meant a late block Pete and Pete, that offbeat backyard mythology energy where Halloween felt embedded in the suburb itself. Often it meant Are You Afraid of the Dark closing out the night with a match strike and the hush of the Midnight Society. That Snick Midnight Society handoff mattered. It formalized an almost primitive ritual. Last first, then Goosebumps. You turn off the week with sketch comedy, parody mall cops, loud characters, and by the time that last half an hour rolled around, the room was dark, the snacks were gone, and the show was asking you to listen. Are You Afraid of the Dark didn't just fit Snick, it defined its curve. Kids running the ceremony, stories framed as gifts, endings that felt that left a smudge instead of a lecture. It was perfect Saturday night courage. It was this perfect box for storytelling that blended seamlessly into Halloween because it understood that Halloween wasn't a night, it was a lane, it was a whole vibe. Every October, the block reskinned itself. Cobweb logos, bat silhouettes crossing the bottom corner, promos where slime oozed down jack-o'-lantern teeth. The lineup leaned spooky without abandoning variety. Pete and Pete reruns like Halloweeny would kick things off. You had Alex Mack with that science gone weird plot, and then you get the Midnight Society telling a spooky story. Halloween was braided through comedy and adventure, so the whole 2 hours belonged to the month. As the block evolved, Snick experimented with how live and interactive it could feel. The late 90s had Snick House, which folded in call-ins, guest drop-bys, music acts, banter, but the DNA stayed the same. You were hanging out with the network as much as you were watching it. That mattered in October, when the block could push little events, viewer costume shots between shows, a scariest moment poll, teases to a Saturday-only premiere of a new episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark? You weren't just a viewer. You were part of the party. Snick's influence goes beyond nostalgia, too. It demonstrated that programming architecture can create a culture. By carving out a specific time and mood, your night, built around your pace and your tolerance for the dark, it taught a generation what appointment TV feels like when the appointment is on your level. It normalized the idea that horror can live inside of a variety block, that Halloween was fun and spooky, and that October can tint even comedy. that a network can say you belong here now simply by anchoring the night with a story told around a fire. This was a kid-safe on-ramp and the formative moments for a whole lot of folks that would go on to be horror hounds later on in life. Once you graduated from SNCC, you had your weekend Twilight Zone reruns, and then you had AMC's Monster Fest. If you were brave, you would head into the deeper stuff, the HBO stuff, Tales from the Crypt, Tales from the Dark Side, stuff like that. If you want to understand why so many viewers treat the 90s as Halloween's heyday, that orange couch is a big reason. SNCC didn't just air shows. It curated a night that felt like the first time that you were allowed to be part of the after hours party. It gave you laughter to take the edge off, weirdness to make the air buzz, and finally a campfire story to carry upstairs into the dark and to share with your friends back at school. On the pop side of horror, you had Goosebumps, which swung big a lot of the time. Monsters with faces that you could doodle in the margins of your notebook. It was an icon factory. Every episode aimed to produce one image that stuck in your memory. A mask fused to a face, a dummy with a smirk that promises trouble, a camera that predicts disaster. It ran on momentum. Grab the premise, escalate fast, clip the commercial breaks, tag with a kicker. If Are You Afraid of the Dark is a candlelit circle, Goosebumps is a neon haunted house that you could walk through inside of 22 minutes and come out grinning on the other side, ready to tell your friends about it. The Haunted Mask is a miniature body horror play with identity and pressure baked in. Night of the Living Dummy, Minted Slappy, a smirk that practically sells itself. The show never apologized for being fun. It made horror shareable and accessible for a lot of folks. Lunchtime storytelling, playground dares, Halloween costumes, its images became shorthand, a vocabulary for fear that you could trade with your friends. Sitting right between those two poles was the younger version of a tilted world of weird. You had Eerie, Indiana, which featured suburban horror with a funhouse mirror feel. It was sharp with satire, sticky with small town paranoia. Marshall moves to the most ordinary place on earth and immediately realizes that the sidewalks are lying. Foreverwhere is the perfect pilot statement. A Tupperware style product that literally vacuum seals people to keep them fresh. A joke about American youth culture that curdles into body horror as two neighborhood kids are revealed to have been kept on ice for decades. The Loyal Order of Corn turns a civic club into a cult. The Dead Letter makes First Love into a ghost story. Reality Takes a Holiday breaks the set wall and lets Marshall wander into a TV studio where his life is a show. It was meta before Wes Craven would bring meta back into the forefront. The tone is Joe Dante by way of school newspaper, weary, conspiratorial, and genuinely sweet about the friendship between Marshall and his best friend Simon. It's not mean, it doesn't have gore, and it doesn't need it. It just keeps asking, what if the weirdest part of America is the part that we call normal? Then you had its moodier cousin, So Weird, a paranormal road story fronted by Fiona Phillips, a tech-curious teenager touring with her rock star mom. Every town is a liminal space. Truck stop, motel, backroom of a venue, a forgotten cemetery, by the interstate. The show's secret engine is grief. Fee's father died when she was young, and she's half hunting monsters, half reaching across the veil looking for him. The pilot, Family Reunion, lays it all out. A ghost ship, EVP recordings, Fee's first glimpses of a pattern. Strange Geometry folds a haunted house into math and memory. Sacrifice takes on banshees and the cost of warnings. Roswell lets UFO lore rub elbows with the music tour grind. The investigations are ultimately low tech, web forums, printouts, a mini disc recorder, so the hauntings feel real, like they could happen at that time. And the show isn't afraid to get genuinely unsettling before it lets you go. For a Disney production, it has a surprisingly raw ache. A kid show that respects the weight of questions that it can't cleanly answer. When the series shifts its leads in later episodes, you feel the tone lighten. But those first two seasons remain a minor miracle. They are scary, sincere, and emotionally honest about why the unknown is so attractive. Hovering over all of this, the defining machine of the decade, The X-Files. It bridged horror, sci-fi, and conspiracy into something weakly, compulsive, and strangely intimate. The two-track structure, Myth Arc and Monster of the Week, let it be a playground and a cathedral. The Monster of the Week canon is ridiculous in its range and precision. Squeeze and its sequel, Tombs, is urban legend anatomy to a T. A killer who can contort and crawl through vents, the camera peering into impossible spaces until your own house vents feel suspect. Ice is paranoia in a bottle, lifted from movies like The Thing and translated into network television. You can feel the air thicken as trust evaporates. Home, sidelined for years on reruns, remains one of the most infamous warnings. Even with standards and practices, television can still cross lines and make them feel scorched. Put together, these shows cover the whole map. Tales from the Crypt gives you stylish knife skills. Tales from the Dark Side of Monsters gives you campfire blade whittled from nothing. Freddy's Nightmares and Friday the 13th give you a retooling of a myth. Poltergeist, The Legacy, and Millennium prove that horror can wear a suit and still unsettle you. Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps induct the next generation. And Eerie, Indiana, So Weird, and X-Files bring that weird flair to the mix. Moving into the mid 90s and really into the 2000s, we learned a very simple truth that you do not need a horror show to make television feel haunted. In the 90s and 2000s, October turned into a broadcast season with its own patterns. Sitcoms put on costumes and treated Halloween like their Super Bowl. Networks wrapped even non-scary programming in cobwebbed bumpers. Commercials that people generally hated became appointment and part of the overall experience during this time. Cable discovered that if you stacked enough movies in a row, a channel could become the soundtrack for carving pumpkins, building costumes, and falling asleep in front of a pile of wrappers. The result is a feeling that so many people associate with the holiday season. When they say that vibe of the holiday season, it's the ambient mood that your TV can produce on demand. Start with the single most reliable Halloween ritual on TV, The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror. 3 segments, 1 frame, and a litany of references. The genius isn't just the jokes, it is the way that the jokes bring in this entire history of horror. The Shining doesn't just poke Kubrick, it explains his stories. Endless carpets, corridors, obsessive patterns, madness presented as interior design. Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace introduces the idea of a dream stalker in a way that kids can absorb without the trauma. And The Raven goes full-blown lit class with Poe turning meter and melancholy into something that you can quote at school. The next day, year after year, Tree House of Horror becomes something that is more communal than singular. One act has Hitchcock, the next act has Romero. Throw in a dash of Twilight Zone for good measure. It's how a generation learned the canon before they ever rented the originals. The segments are short enough to be shareable, strong enough to invite repeat viewings, and cheeky enough to make you feel like you're getting away with something that you shouldn't. That's the perfect formula for Halloween. Where Treehouse taught the canon, shows like Roseanne really brought the craft. The Connors Halloween episodes are a masterclass in do-it-yourself spooks. There's fog machines set up in the living room, thrift store costumes that elevated the weird determination, practical jokes that escalate like slasher sequels, but always landing with a heartfelt hug. It's Halloween for the working class. Every sitcom has a holiday that it treats like free candy. For a surprising number of them, Halloween isn't just a date on the calendar. It is a permission slip to break the format, crank up the chaos, and let characters wear on the outside what they usually keep bottled up. The best Halloween episodes aren't just costume parades. They're studies in identity, roleplay, and how far a family will go to scare or save each other. Start with the patron saint, right? You have the format that celebrates it so expressly with The Simpsons, and then you move into shows like Roseanne, and then also Home Improvement followed suit with yearly yard haunt arms races. Tim turned suburban DIY into gothic ambition. Laser pumpkins, animatronics, the whole thing. While Jill's patience wore as thin as a Stone brand cobweb. The joke was always the same, and it was always effective. Halloween exposes Tim's need to overbuild and one up. Then gently, pranks bring him back down to size. The holiday is character truth serum, served with a plastic cauldron. Flip on NBC, and during their must-see era, you get a different flavor. Frasier staged an elegant farce at a literary costume party, where misunderstanding snowballs under masks and capes. A rumor about Roz spiraled because everyone was half hidden and fully dramatic. When pretension meets Plastic Fangs, you get pure farce power. Friends, meanwhile, distilled Halloween to one perfect party. Ross as Sputnik, trying to explain a pun. Chandler humiliated in a pink bunny suit. Monica stress hosting like she's competing in the Olympics. The jokes aren't about fear, they're about social performance. Costumes are walking punchlines that heighten every insecurity in the room. The 90s also gave us Halloween as gateway to gleeful camp. Family Matters went full horror comedy with Stevel, the evil ventriloquist dummy that turned TGIF into Goosebumps. It was ridiculous on purpose, channeling the urban legend energy kids brought to the cafeteria on November 1st. The Fresh Prince pushed towards the supernatural with a seance gone wrong tale that let the show flirt with spooky without losing its snap. That 70s show was nostalgia plus homage, doing classic haunted house beats and then later riffing on Hitchcock shot for shot. Even when the plots aren't about Halloween, the costume logic makes the characters' teenage melodrama feel like they're living inside old movie posters. Come the 2000s, Halloween became a sandbox for metaplay. How I Met Your Mother mythologized the slutty pumpkin, turning holiday FOMO into years-long romantic quests. One night in costume becomes a legend Ted tries to resurrect annually, which tells you everything about him. He's a man who wants life to behave like a themed episode. New Girl perfected the same principle across two modes. First, a haunted house where Nick's fear and Jess's optimism crash into each other in the dark. And later, Keaton, where the gang weaponizes a childhood Batman letterhead to save Schmidt from himself. The holiday lets the show literalize emotional masks. Sometimes your inner Bruce Wayne is just a friend writing in block letters. Brooks and Rec did Halloween as a test of civic pride and personal growth. Greg Pickus is a cozy caper about a teen vandal who exists purely to antagonize Leslie's sense of order. The costume party in Meet and Greet blows up into petty feuds and heartfelt apologies wrapped in store-bought capes. Halloween becomes municipal, a reminder that community is messy, sugary, and worth cleaning up in the morning. Over on The Office, every costume is a diagnostic tool. Michael Scott's two-headed monster, Dwight's serial killer affect, Jim's minimalist gag costume. They all expose office politics better than any quarterly report. Later episodes sharpen that idea using the holiday to stir up rivalries, flex ambition, and prove that a paper company can do horror. Community goes full nerd. Modern Family makes Halloween a character flaw that you can love. And then there's Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which turns Halloween into a ritualized heist. The tradition starts as a bragging contest and evolves into a relationship engine, culminating in a particularly joyous entry, a proposal set inside the world's pettiest caper. What begins as I'm the greatest detective / genius becomes we are each other's person, all while Boyle sweats through a pun costume. It is Halloween used not for horror, but for rule breaking, for mischief. A sanctioned night where precinct decorum gets replaced by elaborate cons and heartfelt reveals. Animated sitcoms built whole haunted mansions out of the idea. And sitcoms put the family inside the haunted mansion. What ties all of these together isn't just the pumpkins and the pranks. Halloween is sitcom jet fuel because it lets characters try to alternate versions of themselves while the world temporarily agrees with the bit. Costumes literalize internal conflicts. The attention seeker wears the loudest outfit. The control freak designs the maze. The romantic pins their hopes on a once-a-year meet cute. It all shows us a side of ourselves in a measure of safety. When you look at Halloween on TV and horror on TV, it is important to understand that it's not just about how scary it can be. It's also about how much heart and what other associated emotions are conveyed through the medium of television. Outside of laugh tracks, the kids' channels and genre blocks are curating their own October during this time as well. Freeform's 13 nights, now 31 nights, become a cozy pipeline for things like Hocus Pocus, which became appointment viewing of the time, Burton's stop-motion gothics, and Halloween Town. Sci-Fi's 31 Days of Halloween braided Twilight Zone reruns, original creature features, and ghost specials into a month-long mood. Disney Channel leaned into family-friendly spooks, and sitcoms handled weeknights. TNT's Monster Fest, especially with the Joe Bob Briggs era, turned creature features into a hangout spot. He didn't just show movies, he anointed them, mixing trivia and drive-in patter until schlock felt like a community college course taught by your cool uncle. It wasn't just a movie, it was company. In the midst of all of that, I mentioned one particular spectacle, and that's AMC's FearFest. There is a specific hum to a house in October when AMC is on in the background. The room picks up a low synth pulse. A scream echoes from 3 scenes ago, and you can smell pumpkin everywhere. That's the signature of AMC's FearFest. The marathon that figured out how to make a TV channel behave like a jack-o'-lantern, lit at dusk, steady through the night, welcoming anyone who happens to wander by. FearFest didn't spring fully formed, though. In the late 90s and early 2000s, it went by MonsterFest, a simpler promise, classics, creatures, and spooky features. But the idea was already in place for something more. The schedule became a season, and when branding shifted to FearFest, the programming widened and deepened. Slashers joined the black and white legend. Stephen King telefilms rotated with Romero marathons. Carpenter's synths bled into Universal Flog. The tone wasn't a special night. It was October, all month long. What made FearFest different from a singular movie block was the architecture around the films. AMC didn't just air titles, it curated them into intentional blocks. Afternoons might be creature features, PG-13 fare, background for decorating, baking, answering the door. Primetime became franchise stacks. A Friday the 13th gauntlet, where summer camp feels like a ritual you keep trying to survive. A night of Romero, where the shambling pace seeps into your bones. And after midnight, the channel leaned gnarlier. The cuts might be broadcast safe still, but the mood skewed late night. Grimier slashers, weirder 80s relics, anthology outliers that might feel like you found a box of cassettes. Most of the time, you're not watching a movie during FearFest. You're in October with AMC as the thermostat. You start something while scooping seeds. You're at the sink when the sequel kicks in, and you come back to the couch for part 3. Someone texts you, you miss half the next one, it doesn't matter. The room resets. By the time Night of the Living Dead or Universal Monster Cycle glides in, you're lulled into the rhythm. For a stretch in the 2000s and early 10s, the cornerstone of those pulses, especially on weekend nights, was Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, and Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers. Because of licensing realities, AMC often had these two on heavy rotation, sometimes anchoring entire evening corridors and re-airing into the late hours. The effect was cultural. For a generation, the TV feel of October wasn't just John Carpenter's 78 original. It was the late 80s sequel's specific flavor of Haddonfield. That's what happened with me. I've talked about this. That's why my preferred version of Haddonfield are those later sequels. That emphasis told you something. That horror was about eras. Drop in Halloween 4, and you're in the late 80s slasher economy. Small town autumn soaked in sodium vapor orange, lawmen in pickup trucks, a community mobilizing with shotguns. Michael is less an artist's metaphor than a seasonal weather system, inevitable, returning. Crossfade into Halloween 5, and you feel the genre shifting again. More barbaric kills, gaudier masks, the franchise logic tightening its grip. Place those broadcasts against the rest of FearFest lineup, and you are time traveling by way of the remote. Universal's 1930 Gothics, Carpenter's 78 original, Halloween 4 and 5, 90s meta. It was all mapped out for anyone to grab. The packaging strengthened the hypnosis. You had these features that braided trivia with tentpole films, and when AMC brought in celebrity intros or themed nights, directors chatting about their influences, curated picks that linked a slasher gag to a noir twist with a silent classic, the channel started to feel like a film club. You had pillars like franchise corridors. When rights aligned, you'd get reruns of full movie franchises. Canon Crash Course, Night of the Living Dead, The Exorcist, Psycho, Karloff, Lugosi. Then you had King's Country. You had Carrie and Christine, Pet Sematary, and Cujo. 80s and 90s oddities, FearFest that drew in basically cable era curios, weird outliers that a lot of people wouldn't have heard about otherwise. Part of FearFest power is domestic. It's not trying to pin you to the couch. It's trying to haunt the room while you live your life. It is normalizing horror for the average household. Were there quirks? Sure. Broadcast edits sparked eternal debates. What's lost to standards and practices? What's gained by suggestion? Licensing meant lineups changed year to year. Your favorite franchise might live somewhere else in October, or just not at all. But even those constraints became part of the game. Friends screen shooting grids with circles and arrows, households planning pumpkin carving, costume building around specific blocks. FearFest turned programming into planning. Couldn't wrap up our conversation without talking about the bridge point between classic TV horror and the streaming age with two shows. We start off the conversation with The Walking Dead. When The Walking Dead shambled onto AMC in October 2010, it revived not just zombies, but horror on TV. By the time it hit its peak in season 5, it was watched by roughly 17 million viewers and outdrew most broadcast juggernauts in that prized 18 to 49 demo. It brought cinematic brutality and coupled it with practical craft. The show married character-driven survival drama with hands-on film caliber effects. It had visceral scenery coupled with heartfelt character drama. It brought a higher ceiling of violence and stress tested what basic cable would allow in a way that really hadn't been seen up to that point, even with the shows that we talked about in yesteryear. It married moral horror to the monster of the week format and gave us long arcs that took zombie fiction and reframed it as ethical siege drama with communities, governance, resource scarcity, and the cost of leadership. Meanwhile, they also cemented the after show format with the AMC Talking Dead show that aired after Walking Dead. The show also benefited from the early Netflix effect. You could catch up on streaming and you could binge entire seasons. This really was the first major show that saw both worlds, where it was born in a time where it was still appointment television, but also came along at a time where people that didn't catch it right at the beginning could catch up after the fact. So by the time those later seasons came around, you had a lot of people that jumped on, binged, and then were watching on a week by week basis. At this point, they had built an entire horror universe on AMC. Fear the Walking Dead, World Beyond, Tales of the Walking Dead, Dead City. There were crossovers, there were time jumps, there was region hopping. In 2023 to 2025, spin-offs kept premiering, expanding to Europe and beyond, and they're still in production today. The ratings and boundary pushing violence helped open the gates for really what would become a whole surge of 2010s horror storytelling on the big screen, including Ash versus the Evil Dead, The Haunting of Hill House, and another show that we have to talk about, American Horror Story, FX's anthology TV horror. It didn't just revive TV anthology, it made horror feel like a prestige event again. AHS normalized season-long anthology, where it was episode by episode previously. You had whole arcs, and at first they were seemingly disconnected. It wasn't until later on that you started to see actual continuity from season to season build out. It came swinging out of the gate with its first couple of seasons, Murder House and Asylum, that established the tone. Haunted House Tragedy with Institutional Dread. Apocalypse later pulled off the first franchise crossover, braiding Murder House and Coven with nods to Hotel into an end times witch war, essentially. You had AHS treating casting like a TV event. Jessica Lange's early run helped brand the show as an actor forward horror. Lady Gaga's Golden Globe winning turn in Hotel proved stunt casting could also be substantial. Beyond ratings and awards, AHS mainstreamed a queer and camp-inflicted sensibility within horror, folding drag and fashion and outsider narratives into primetime spectacle. It also widened the vocabulary for TV horror. You could watch Witch Covens one season, you could watch a slasher homage in another, political anxieties in another, all inside the same franchise frame. AHS proved TV horror could be prestige by way of provocation. This is a show that isn't necessarily for everyone because it pushes the envelope in ways that some of the others do, or some of the others don't. But it dares to do something different, and that's what makes it so special. So that's it for our walk through history. Like I said, at this point, horror lives on streaming, and that's not the worst thing in the world. But this is the roots where, in looking at all of these miniseries and all of these high impact runs on streaming, these shows here crawled so that way those ones could run. And when you look at the history of horror TV and Halloween, it is undeniable that TV was a center point in all of that. So that's it for now. Drop down below what your favorite era was and what your favorite horror TV show is. But until next time, stay spooky.